Coming up today, Korea's election watchdog fails to finalize a plan for redrawing the country's electoral districts. The National Assembly will now be tasked with finding a solution. Chinese imports slump as slowdown worries return. This could mean trouble for countries like Korea that are heavily dependent on the world's second biggest economy for trade. Plus, Dutch investigators say the MH17 passenger plane disaster over Ukraine was caused by a Russian-made missile. Stay tuned for these stories and more.
Hello to our viewers around the world. It's 6 a.m. on Wednesday, October 14th here in Seoul. Thank you for joining us. I'm Mark Broome. Our top story this morning, Korea's rival parties are struggling to reach a compromise over how to redraw the country's electoral map. It had been the task of a special committee under the National Election Commission, but after they drew a blank, it has been tossed over to the full National Assembly. Ji Myung-gil starts us off.
The redistricting committee said Tuesday its 8-member panel had been discussing whether to reduce the number of electoral districts to 244 or increase it to 249 from the current 246. Its failure to make a decision by the Tuesday deadline means it will now be up to the National Assembly to decide.
The redistricting committee had problems finding a middle ground on redrawing the electoral districts. We hope the National Assembly will be able to make the decision.
The ruling Saenuri Party urged the opposition to cooperate in devising a new plan.
Politicians should have proposed the electoral rezoning scheme to the National Election Commission. Now the rival parties should start negotiating to meet the new deadline of November 13th.
The party wants to reduce the number of proportional representatives and increase the number of electoral districts. The main opposition New Politics Alliance for Democracy is against that plan.
Maintaining the proportional representation system is necessary to help socially vulnerable communities and to bring in new talent.
Lawmakers representing rural areas have been critical of both parties and the Parliamentary Political Reform Committee, saying they're not taking matters seriously. The lawmakers don't want to see their districts merged or erased, and to remedy that, they've proposed increasing the number of assembly seats to more than the current 300. The Election Watchdogs Committee was trying to reflect a ruling by the Constitutional Court last year that said the current electoral map fails to provide equal representation due to changes in Korea's population. Ji Myung-gil, Arirang News.
Turning now to the latest on the controversy over history textbooks. And Korea's ruling party says the government chose the right path by taking control of the content, as it will provide a more balanced view of Korea's modern history. The main opposition party couldn't disagree more. It says the government's move is an attempt to distort facts and whitewash the darker parts of Korea's history. Park Ji-won has more.
Dispute over the adoption of a single state-authorized history textbook is now at the center of parliamentary politics. During a 4-day interpellation session at the National Assembly that began Tuesday, lawmakers from the ruling Saenuri Party backed the government's decision. They said the choice had to be made in order to teach the nation's young people a proper historic perspective, as the textbooks currently in use contain imbalanced views about Korea's modern history.
Although I haven't read all the history textbooks, I have read some of the more problematic parts that glorify Lenin, or say communism is not related to imperialism, or that former President Lee Seung-man caused a division of the Korean peninsula. Do you know about this?
I know that some of the current history textbooks include contents that distort the facts, so the public is concerned about the matter.
The main opposition New Politics Alliance for Democracy called the government's move wrong in an attempt to enforce conformity. The party also characterized the decision as a dictatorial attempt to whitewash the country's authoritarian past. During the session, lawmakers grilling the prime minister asked about his perspective on the May 16th coup in 1961, carried out by former President Park Chung-hee, the father of current President Park Geun-hye and his allies. The legacy of the coup is at the heart of an irreconcilable difference between the rebel parties. The ruling party sees it as laying the foundation for the nation's rapid economic growth, calling it the May 16th revolution, while the opposition sees it as a major suppression of democracy.
Do you see it as the May 16th military coup or the May 16th revolution? Which do you identify with? What is your historic perspective? What is your identity as Prime Minister?
I've always tried my best to be loyal to the Constitution.
Meanwhile, President Park Geun-hye offered her first remarks on the controversy before heading to the U.S. on Tuesday. She said it is very important that the nation's young people have the right view of history through proper history classes, not only for the future of Korea, but also for the unification of the two Koreas. Park Ji-won, Arirang News.
A recent opinion poll shows that more than 8 out of 10 Americans think the country's relations with South Korea are important. According to the survey conducted by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs on 2,000 Americans, 83% of respondents said relations with Seoul are important for the U.S. The survey also showed that 2/3 of Americans view South Korea as a reliable partner. 62% were in support of South Korea exerting strong leadership in world affairs. When asked about the use of U.S. forces to defend South Korea in the event of a North Korean attack, 47% of the respondents voiced their support. Now, that figure is the highest it has been since the Council began conducting the survey in the mid-1970s. The USS Ronald Reagan will sail to South Korea this month to take part in a round of naval drills between the two allies and to celebrate a key anniversary. But some experts fear the arrival of the nuclear-powered aircraft carrier could actually set inter-Korean relations back a notch. Kim Hyun-bin reports.
This is the USS Ronald Reagan, the U.S. Navy's key strategic weapon in the Asia-Pacific region. It is scheduled to set sail for South Korea next week to help the Korean Navy celebrate a 70th anniversary slated for October 23rd. After that, it will stay in the country to participate in a round of naval drills between South Korea and the U.S., scheduled to get underway on the 26th. During the drill, the vessel will conduct anti-submarine and warship operations in the East Sea, in tandem with South Korea's Aegis destroyers and dozens of other vessels. The Ronald Reagan arrived in Japan earlier this month to take over for the USS George Washington, which is undergoing a major overhaul back home. It is the second newest of the 10 carriers in the U.S. Navy's fleet, just behind the USS George Bush. The Reagan is 332 meters long, equivalent to the length of 3 football fields, and has a crew of over 5,000. It has an operational range of over 1,000 kilometers, making it capable of covering the entire Korean peninsula. It is also equipped with 30 state-of-the-art fighter jets and helicopters. Experts have said the U.S. carrier's deployment to South Korea comes at a sensitive time and is bound to put pressure on North Korea. Military officials say, however, they will not try to provoke North Korea with the joint drills, as a round of reunions for war-separated families is scheduled to start 2 days before the carrier's arrival. Kim Hyun-bin, Arirang News.
Now, the results of an investigation on the passenger jet crash over Ukraine last year has shown that Malaysia Airlines flight MH17 was downed by a Russian-made missile. In its report released on Tuesday, the Dutch Safety Board reached the conclusion that the missile, fired from an area controlled by Russian-backed separatists, was detonated near the plane's cockpit. Now, Russia continues to deny involvement, challenging the conclusion with its own probe by a state arms manufacturer. It said that after carrying out its own testing, the experimental aircraft's remains showed a much different damage pattern than the remains of MH17. Experts and Western governments believe pro-Russian rebels shot down the aircraft, possibly mistaking it for a Ukrainian military plane. Flight MH17 was flying from Amsterdam to Kuala Lumpur on July 17th last year when it came down over eastern Ukraine, killing all 298 people on board. A new audio clip from the Islamic State group reportedly calls for holy war against the United States and Russia. According to Reuters, a spokesman for the extremist group calls on young Muslims worldwide to start a holy war against Russians and Americans who, according to Islamic State, are waging a crusaders' war against Muslims. Both countries are conducting their own separate campaigns against the IS group. Russia's defense ministry says Islamic State militants have suffered significant losses since Russia began its airstrikes over Syria late last month. It says Russian jets flew almost 90 sorties over Syria on Tuesday. Two of the world's biggest beer companies have agreed to merge in a $104 billion deal. SAB Miller, which makes Miller Genuine Draft, Peroni and Grolsch, is set to be taken over after tentatively reaching a deal over an improved offer from its Belgium-based rival AB InBev, which is the brewer of Budweiser. The mega deal, which will create the world's biggest drinks firm, might not be great news for consumers, though. The Wall Street Journal says the merger reshuffles the global beer industry and sets the stage for higher beer prices worldwide. China has released its trade figures for September. Its exports didn't fall as much as expected, but imports plunged more than 20%, raising alarm bells for countries like Korea that are heavily dependent on China for trade. Kim Min-ji has the details.
Is China's economic slowdown worse than we thought? In September, Beijing's exports fell 3.7% in dollar-denominated terms from the same month a year ago. Imports also fell more than 20% on year, quickening from a nearly 14% drop in August. With that said, the country's trade surplus for last month came to just over $60 billion.
The rising cost of labor is the main cause of companies' declining competitive advantage, which is limiting companies' capacity to expand their manufacturing and exports.
Although export prices were better than market expectations of about a 7% decline, a plunge in import figures, which are reflective of weak domestic demand, will add to concerns that China's slowdown will continue to have a negative impact on other economies dependent on China for trade, such as Korea.
As Korea is dependent on China for exports, it's likely that the effect will be hard felt. It can be said that China's declining import numbers are reflective of Korea's slowing exports. Down the road, it will also hurt Korea's economic growth.
Experts say the situation isn't likely to get better anytime soon because despite China's move to devalue its currency, it hasn't helped prop up its trade figures, which will in turn continue to have a negative impact on the global economy. Kim Min-ji, Arirang News.
Now, the pedestrian bridge near Noryangjin Station in Seoul is set to be demolished in the coming days after 35 years of use. While a few might be sad to see the local landmark go, many, especially pedestrians, will appreciate the changes that will follow. Lee Soo-eun reports.
For 35 years, this pedestrian bridge has been a landmark feature of Noryangjin, a neighborhood famous for being home to the biggest fish market in Korea and countless private cram schools. But now it's time to say goodbye, as it will be demolished this weekend.
For years, I've been crossing the bridge to go to the fish market. I'm really sad it's going to disappear.
This sentiment is shared by many locals, but there are important reasons the bridge must go.
There are safety concerns regarding the bridge's vibrations and fluctuations. Also, the physically impaired, children, and elderly often find it difficult to use, so a new crosswalk will replace it.
Demolishing aging pedestrian bridges is part of a bigger movement to create roads that are safer and more pedestrian-friendly, but progress has been slow. This road has 600 meters of hill without a single crosswalk, leaving only this underground walkway, no escalator or elevator for disabled access. And here, a road without a sidewalk exposes pedestrians to traffic dangers. Korea's pedestrian fatality rate is nearly 4 times the OECD average. Almost 4 out of every 10 road deaths in the country are pedestrians. It's an alarming problem that experts say can be helped.
First, sidewalks need to be set aside for pedestrian space. Second, safety infrastructure, like raised crosswalks and speed bumps, can help reduce speeding. But the most important thing is for drivers to drive slowly and carefully, with the awareness that they are sharing the road with pedestrians.
For future generations, progress towards creating safer and more convenient roads for pedestrians ultimately hinges on education and making sure the public follows the basic principle of pedestrian first before anything else. 이수은, Arirang News.
Well, that's all we have for now. I'm Mark Broome. Have a wonderful day, and thank you as always for tuning in. Goodbye.